Latin from scratch, very important class. Relative pronoun and relative clauses morphosyntax. Here we see the table of contents. So the relative pronoun, like of course there is more than one relative pronoun in Latin, but we are going to study the one which is used like 95% of the times, qui, quae, quod. Then this is like the pronoun itself. Now, why do we need this pronoun? So then we see the syntax of relative clauses, then the types of relative clauses, the something which is kind of different, which is the false relative and how it is used and how to translate it, and finally the interrogative pronoun quis, quae, quid, which we'll see why we studied now. So first, relative pronoun, qui, quae, quod. Why do we call it qui, quae, quod? Of course, this is the statement. No? The statement of the relative pronoun is qui, quae, quod. So here we see qui, quae, quod. So pretty much like a 2-1-2 adjective. Okay, nominative of masculine singular, feminine singular, neuter singular. So this is the most frequent relative pronoun. Its declension is very similar to that of the other pronouns we already know. If you remember, there are other, like for example, ik, ik, ok, which means pretty much that the genitive singular is always the same, ius, 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 and then the dative singular is always the same, also I, I. Now, of course, table, so you have to study it. Like you already know many tables, so it is not so hard. There are many things in common with other tables, so it's not so hard. Then, as you can see, the relative pronoun has the same form for the genitive singular in all three genders, and the same form and the same for the dative singular. Notice that these are the only forms written with C. Okay, so C, like you see that it's always Q. You, of course, so qui, quae, quod, qui, quae, quae, etc., etc. Of course, this is not a mistake. This is actually qui, quae, quae. Okay, so there are a few things which are kind of strange, but that's just how it is. Then, again, here, notice, it's always with Q, except for these 6, which are C, U. And then you even see that here, when we have Q, U, it's just a consonant. The U is not an actual vowel, okay? But here, yes, the U is an actual vowel, okay? So remember that, it's an actual vowel. So it's Q, use. Here is just qui, one syllable. Here is Q, use, okay? So that's why it is written with C, because the U is an actual vowel. Here the U is part of the consonant. Okay. So that you just have to learn the table. Then here I also say they can also be found as quoius and quoi, like quoius and quoi. These are archaic forms, so most of the times you will just find these forms, but in some, like Sallust, etc., these authors that we have already mentioned, that like to use older forms, then they tend to use these older forms. That's why they are archaic. Then in English, the universal relative pronoun is that, but also who is used quite often referring to people. So you see here, I mean, in English, you can use that for everything. It's like universal, but also in English, it is quite frequent who, when you are referring to people. So there are two different pronouns, of course, whom, whose, etc. But in Latin, it's always qui, quae, quod. Of course, it's with all these forms, but it's always the same pronoun. Okay, so that was the table. You just have to learn it by heart, as usual. Now, the syntax of relative clauses, like how do you use this pronoun and how does it appear in sentences, etc. How to translate it, how to analyze it, all of that. Relative clauses are subordinate adjective clauses. So subordinate clause, precisely an adjective, like it works instead of an adjective, okay? They give information, so that's what adjectives do. They give information about a noun or a pronoun. So these like relative clauses also give information about a noun or pronoun in the superordinate clause, okay? Information about a noun or pronoun in the same way that an adjective would. The relative pronoun introduces relative clauses, obviously. That is, subordinate adjective clauses. Their main function is giving information about a word in the superordinate clause, which is called antecedent. I really don't know how to pronounce this, but I guess it's antecedent. Or, yeah, I would say antecedent. So, the antecedent. So, again, what is the antecedent? We are going to see now in the examples, okay? Relative pronouns agree with the antecedent in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. So this is important because always when we were talking about adjectives, we were saying like the adjective agrees in case, number, and gender, etc. And we were saying all the time, no, like gender, number, case, gender, number, case, gender, number, case. Here, no, or not necessarily. So yes, they agree in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. Now, since the antecedent and the relative pronoun belong to different sentences, their syntactic function might be different, thus being in different cases. Okay, we are going to see it with the examples. Here we have Rosae was witty, pulchrae sunt. So here, this is the roses that I saw are beautiful. Okay, so here, if we analyze, this is the subject. This is, of course, the verb. This is the attribute to this. And now, this is the relative clause. Okay, relative clause. And now, of course, this is the verb. Now, the relative clause, you see here that this is accusative plural. Accusative plural. So if it is accusative plural, feminine, notice that this is nominative plural feminine. So plural feminine, but this is nominative, this is accusative. So this is the the direct object. Okay, so this is the subject, this is the direct object. So that's why, because this refers to Rosae. So Rosae, this is the antecedent. This is the antecedent, so the relative clause has as antecedent Rosae. Now, Rosae is the subject of the superordinate clause. And this is kind of dirty already, okay? So I'm going to erase all of this. So again, this is the antecedent. This is the subordinate clause, whose antecedent is Rosae. Okay, and Rosae is nominative, plural, feminine. This is accusative because this is the direct object of its sentence. But this is the subject of its sentence. Okay? Now, let's see the opposite. Rosae quae spinas habent periculosae sunt. So here we have again a relative clause. Now this is the subject. Again, this is the attribute. So we see, like, ignoring the relative clause. Roses are dangerous. Now, what roses? Quae spinas habent. Okay, so this is the verb, this is the direct object, and now this is also the subject of its own sentence. Okay, so now, since this is subject and also this is subject, so then this is nominative plural feminine, nominative plural feminine. But here, if you remember, it was accusative, this was nominative, because here this is the subject, this is the direct object. Now subject, subject. Okay, so that's what we were saying all the time before when we were talking, when we were saying that the pronoun can be, always has to be, in the same gender and number, but not necessarily the same case. the case will depend on the function of the pronoun inside the relative clause. Okay? So I know that the explanation is actually harder than the actual thing. Okay, so it is not so hard to understand if you just pay a bit of attention. It's harder to explain than to understand. Okay, so that was the most important part of the class, like learning the relative pronoun and how it works in a sentence, the syntax. No? Now, types of relative clauses. This is, of course, everything is important, no? But let's see how can they be, how can they work, these clauses. In most Latin texts, relative clauses are written between commas because of editorial traditions. Pretty much like most Latin texts that we have currently, they were made by Germans or like in the 19th century or whatever, so commas are used in a different way as we use them now. Okay, so always or most of the times, relative clauses are written between commas, but as you should know, in English, there are two different kinds of relative clauses, those written between commas or without commas. Okay, so we have to see what kind we have in Latin to either write or not write commas in English. Okay, but we should figure out what kind of relative clause we are dealing with and write the commas in our translation only if they are needed. That is, we will almost always find commas in Latin. Now, in English, we have to decide, do we have to write the commas or not? Because depending on whether there are commas or not, the meaning is different. We are going to see. There are two types of relative clauses, restrictive or defining or specifying, like these three names are the same, and non-restrictive, non-defining or explanatory. Like usually, as far as I know, in English grammar, these restrictive and non-restrictive, these are the most common names. Now, in my opinion, they are not very meaningful. So I prefer these, specifying or explanatory, because they specify or because they explain. Okay, that's quite obvious. So, let's see. Restrictive relative clauses are those which specify what, which, who the antecedent is, so they are required. Okay, so the relative clause, the subordinate clause, is required. They don't have their own intonation curve, so they are written without commas. We are going to see. The farmers who were in the field fled to the city. Okay, we are not even focusing on the Latin, okay? So let's just focus on the English. The farmers who were in the field fled to the city. And you hear that I say the farmers who were in the field fled to the city. Like everything is the same intonation, okay? There's no pause, there is no like raise of the intonation, anything, okay? Now, non-restrictive relative clauses, on the other hand, only explain something about the antecedent, so they aren't required, and they could be written between parentheses, like either between parentheses or like we could remove them completely. They have their own intonation curve independent from the superordinate clause, so they are written between commas. Now, you see that the sentences are exactly the same except for the commas. Now, the farmers who were in the field fled to the city. So you have noticed first the intonation, like the farmers who were in the field fled to the city, and the pauses. So that intonation and the pauses are represented by the commas in writing. And of course, you can feel, I'm sure that you can feel the difference in meaning, but we are going to explain it literally. In the first sentence, only the farmers who were in the field fled. Farmers who were otherwise didn't flee. Whereas in the second sentence, all the farmers who happened to be in the field fled. Okay? And that's the difference between these two types of relative clauses. That's why it is so important to know what type it is in Latin to either write or not write the commas in our translation. Okay? Most of the times, relative clauses have a verb in the indicative mood, in which case they just have the values already indicated above. So if they are in the indicative mood, that's it. We already know everything. However, they can also have their verb in the subjunctive, in which case they have also some adverbial value, usually purpose. When this, if this appears, we will explain it then. But for now, just like indicative mood, just relative clause, just like a translation in English, and that's it. Now, what we call false relative. Probably there is some other terminology in the English grammar, but in my tradition, the Spanish tradition, it is called either falso relativo, or we could maybe call it in English linking relative, whatever, it doesn't matter the name, okay? Among other names, is a structure where we have a relative pronoun not introducing a subordinate relative clause. We were saying at the beginning, like a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. Okay, so here this is a false relative because it doesn't introduce a relative clause. That's why it is a false relative pronoun. They are easy to spot because the false relative appears right after a period, colon, or semicolon. We were saying before that a relative clause comes usually right after the antecedent. Now, if this false relative appears right after a period, colon, or semicolon, there is no antecedent. Okay, so that's why it is a false relative. In these cases, they are replacing a demonstrative pronoun in order to better connect semantically the new sentence with the previous one. We translate it as a demonstrative. So, for example, quo cognito, so this being known, or quibus rebus cognitis, these things being known, whatever. This is, by the way, constructions which we are going to study quite soon, but now let's just focus on these false relatives. So we see, like they are like right at the beginning of a text. There could be like another sentence, like finished with a period or whatever, but quo cognito, we don't say which being known or that being known or whatever, this being known, these things being known, etc. And finally, the interrogative pronoun quis, quae, quid. And of course, this is also a pronoun, but it's not a relative, it's an interrogative. We just study it now because it's pretty much the same, like it's almost the same table that we studied at the beginning, okay? So the declension of the interrogative pronoun is almost exactly the same as that of the relative pronoun. The differences are quis for the nominative masculine singular, mostly for persons, and quid for the nominative accusative neuter singular, mostly for things. So pretty much is the same table, exactly the same table. You see that is quite long, this lesson, but just like here is quis, quid, quid. The rest is the same. Now, how does this appear in text? For example, here we have quis homo te amat. What man loves you? So here we have quis homo. Here quis is a kind of determiner. Quis homo. So because homo is masculine, so quis masculine. And of course, nominative singular, nominative singular. Okay? So quis homo, what man? We could also just not use homo and say quis pugnat. So who fights? Imagine that it's quis homo pugnat. Then it would be what man fights. Okay? And quid agis? What are you doing? Okay, so you see that it can appear isolated, quid or quis, or as a determiner of a noun. Okay, in all the cases you see that it is about questions. That's why it is an interrogative pronoun, because it introduces a question. Okay, so that's all the theory for this lesson. It is a quite intensive and intense lesson, but it is quite important. So now let's practice.